it finally became obvious to King Louis that the original ways he had of collecting revenue were not going to give him the money that he needed, and the only way he could get the money was to call a meeting of the Estates General. Well, the Estates General had not met in 130 years. So, well, nevertheless, the king needed the money. So he called a meeting of the Estates General to get them to raise the money he needed legally. Just like we do in our country, Congress has to pass tax laws to give the government money. In Britain, it's Parliament. But the problem was the Estates General, once they assembled, they used that as an excuse to turn on the king. The big issue came up when it came time to vote. How was the vote taken? The Estates General had not met in 130 years. There were no historians to tell them how they should take the vote. The fact is, nobody knew how the vote was to be taken. The commoners said, we make up 80% of the population, our vote should count more than the other two estates combined. The other estates said, no, we are the higher ups, there's two of us in our estate, so we should, because what was happening in every issue, these two estates were voting against the commoners, so the vote was always 2-1, with estate 1 and estate 2 voting against estate 3. But the commoners said, now by rights, we should have the final say so, because after all, we're the majority of the people, we're more than 80% of the population. Again, how was the vote taken? Nobody living could tell. Well, time went on. The Estates General drew up what's called the doctrine of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which is described in detail on page 529. Now, what is the natural rights of man? And they even had one, what's the natural rights of the woman? And if you look at them, I mean, it seems like, again, speaking as an American, that these are very reasonable, very what we might expect, except that they were radical, somewhat radical for the time. Well, eventually the Estates General became the National Assembly, and the National Assembly set up Louis XVI as a figurehead, which was somewhat the way the British king at the time was, George III. And the king became more and more unpopular as time went on. And then the king's popularity really took a nosedive when he tried to escape. Now, catch this close, folks. He decided to escape France, riding in the biggest coach that France had. I mean, riding in a huge coach, with his family dressed in royal robes, you might say, royalty, dressed as royalty, and with magnificent steeds driving the coach. Now, let me tell you, after him, two other kings of France decided to escape, but they disguised themselves as paupers and they got away. King Charles X got away as a pauper, and King Louis Philippe later got away as a pauper. They had learned their lesson. Louis XVI almost got to the Austrian border. I mean, he was fleeing to Austria where his wife was from, where they knew they'd be protected. He almost got to the Austrian border. Somebody recognized them, and they got together a posse and ordered him to stop, and they ordered him to go back to Paris. So he didn't get away. Now, I'm going to make a long story short here. Eventually, Louis XVI and his wife were beheaded, something I already mentioned. It was said that Louis XVI was allowed to go to his beheading in a coach. As for Marie Antoinette, she was so unpopular, they put her on a hay wagon, tied her up. But this time, Marie Antoinette's blonde hair had turned gray, and she had aged very fast in a short time. But they were not beheaded together. Louis XVI had been beheaded a few weeks before his wife was, but eventually both of them were executed. And for a time, France did not have a king or a queen. Well, the people of the surrounding countries began to get terrified. They said to themselves, is this going to spread around to other places? Is this all this terror In the meantime, like I already mentioned, the French began to kick out the church, confiscate church lands, force the priests to go work in the fields. You notice to say priests because all other religions other than Roman Catholicism had been outlawed long ago, and all the French Protestants had fled France a few generations before. Well, the other nations of Europe, particularly Austria, began to collect their armies. Austria and Holland and England, Great Britain, began to collect their armies together, prepare for war with France to try to save their world, they said, from complete annihilation. The church was kicked out of France, and all references to Christianity was kicked out. Well, France found itself beset by armies on all sides, and they did something that was to lead to a big change in warfare. The French government said all men, even the blind, even the lame, even those over age, every man above a certain age, rich and poor alike, must report to the army. And if you're blind, we'll find something you can do. If you're crippled, we'll find something to do. But every man must report. The army will take in everybody. And this was to lead to what was to come later in World Wars I and World War II, what's called total war, war all out. And this army of citizens defeated a professional army. I mean, before this time, armed wars consisted of professional soldiers, but this citizen army defeated a professional army, and proved that citizen soldiers could fight. For one thing, the French army outnumbered the other armies that came against it. Again, keep this in mind because this was to explain how Napoleon was to rise up and to conquer a whole lot of France. I mean, conquer a whole lot of Europe. France then went through a reign of terror. During the reign of terror, some 5,000 persons went to guillotine. No one was really safe. You could be executed just if you didn't support the revolution strongly enough. The National Convention, which was running the reign of terror, was determined that nobody was going to be allowed to dissent. In other words, said our rule is law and we control all of France. In effect, the French had executed their king and had gotten in its place a legislative assembly that was far more tyrannical than any king they had ever been. All right. Your book tells about how that they would also use cannon to blow condemned men to open graves because the guillotine was too slow at executing them. So they'd line them up and shoot a cannonball through and drop them into graves that had already been dug. In other words, basically it looked to Europe like civilization had come to an end.